Hi, everyone. Welcome to the part two of your California crop project. Um, you will be doing some research in this part into the production and the distribution of your crop, so the way that it flows through the food system. And you'll be using a couple resources, which I'll go over in this video, as well as what you learned in the week 7 lecture material um, about inputs and different types of costs. So for this part, you on the 19th of October, you'll be doing some research on these different questions. And I'd like you to turn in a typed summary of what you find for each of these questions. Doesn't have to be super long and extensive. Um, but yeah, this is what you're going to answer. So you'll be looking at the different inputs that are required to produce your crop and the operating costs. So what those inputs cost you to use. And for that, you are going to be using these cost and return studies that come from UC Davis. I think that I showed you guys this in the last video, but we will check it out again. So if you hit this link here, it brings you to this webpage. So there's different links for each of the commodities, and I've checked in each of your commodities have a cost study associated with them. So you'll find your commodity here, click on the link, and we're going to do broccoli as an example today. So if I come here, I have several different options for my cost studies. Now, for some of you, I will put a note in the part 2 instructions. Depending on your crop, there might be a specific study that I want you to use for a certain reason, and I'll specify that. So here on this page, we have 2 different studies. They are from the same region, the same counties, and the same year. The difference is the type of broccoli that they are producing. This is a bunched 14 stem broccoli, and this is what we call a crown cut broccoli. So we are going to choose this one, the crown cut, for demo purposes. So this is what the cost study looks like. You have a title page, and then you have a table of contents and an introduction, and this just tells you what the study is all about. And then if you keep scrolling down, you come to this page, assumptions. Now there's a lot of information under here, under assumptions. And this assumptions category or part of the paper encompasses all of these other subheaders that are below it before you see the first table. So the assumptions are basically the assumptions that the researchers make to put out a cost study like this. And we all know that different operations have different ways of doing things and use different inputs and have different costs. So in order to give a baseline, the researchers are saying the costs and the returns that we've come up with through this study assume that growers are using these practices, these kinds of inputs, and working with this scale of farm. So there's a lot of really good information in this section on inputs and on growing information, like what kinds of practices growers use to produce that crop. So you'll find many answers in here under the inputs, material inputs, and cultural practices. So we've got stuff like what kind of fertilizers do they use and how often do they use them? How is this crop usually irrigated? What kinds of pest management stuff do growers have to perform? What kind of pests are they mostly worrying about? How is it harvested? All of this information. And then you have info on labor, equipment use. So some things that we may not think about, here are like labor costs include overtime costs, which is different for agricultural workers than it is for, normal workers working in a restaurant or a shop or something. You have costs associated with federal H-2A programs. H-2A programs are basically visa programs. When we need more agricultural labor than we have in the country, we offer these H-2A visas to folks from out of the country to come in and help us out with our ag work. And employers have to pay for these visas. So that's another cost that we should know about. And then overheads. So overheads are really like a lot of your fixed costs. So things that don't change with how much you're producing. So you have property taxes, insurance, office expenses, rent, participation in food safety programs. These are all overhead costs. They're all fixed costs. Non-cash overhead, I don't want you guys to worry about so much, but what it is, just so you understand, is mostly they're talking about depreciation. So remember in lecture this past week, we talked about how depreciation, so the loss in value of equipment over time, is considered to be a fixed cost. That's what this non-cash overhead is talking about. So yeah, you will find a lot of information about what kinds of inputs are used in there, and they may not particularly use the terms that I've asked you to look into, like land inputs, labor inputs, capital inputs. That's all stuff that you should know. After this lecture, you should be able to identify which of those inputs belong to what category. And they may not identify what is a fixed cost and what is a variable cost. But again, after this last lecture, you guys should be able to identify that. So let's see here. Is this the broccoli one? I forget which tab I clicked on. Let's go through broccoli. Yes, it is. Okay. So now for some tables and numbers. So some of these tables look a little scary. It's a lot of data in there, but the things that I want you to look at, so I've asked you here about total operating cost, cultural operating cost, harvest cost, and cash overhead. So I'll show you where to find those. So this first table is the cost per acre to produce and harvest crown cut broccoli. So these first set of costs way up here, these are your cultural costs. So these double lines indicate the total of all the cultural costs, and these are all of the itemized costs. So we have stuff up here at the beginning, like disking and rolling and subsoiling and cultivating and mulching and shaping beds. These are all things that are land preparation. So these are preparing to actually put your crop in the ground. And you probably don't know what a lot of these mean off the top of your head, but that's okay. Because if you come up to, there should be a land preparation section early on in the assumptions. Here it is. Okay, so yeah, it's one of the first things on the assumptions page is land preparation. And this tells you what items are included in land preparation. And you don't necessarily have to know what each of these means. If you would like to research them or ask me about them, you're more than welcome to. But so yeah, that tells you what of these costs are land preparation. And then you have some other cultural things. So cultural practices in agriculture are basically the things that we have to do to grow the crop. So there are things like planting and fertilizing, which you can see here, applying herbicides, managing pests and diseases, fertilizing, irrigation, weeding, PCA, which is a pest control advisor, and CCA, which is a crop or a certified crop advisor fees. So this is when we have professionals come out to the farm and help us to make decisions about our operation. Those are all things that are included in the total cultural costs. So numbers that we're interested in are in this last column, this total cost column, where it means the total cultural cost. So this $3,550. This is how much a farmer who is growing broccoli under these assumptions, this is how much they are going to spend on their cultural costs per acre of broccoli that they're growing. It says up here, cash and labor costs per acre. So this is one of the numbers that we're interested in. Another number that we're interested in is the harvest cost, which is down here. You'll see total harvest costs, $6,188. So something kind of interesting about harvest, for many vegetable commodity crops that are grown at large scale in California, it's not really feasible for a farmer to go through all of the paperwork and the expense and the insurance and everything of hiring on a bunch of employees to come in for that harvest period. Farms need a lot of help sometimes during the year, and other times they may not need so much help. So one of the ways that they get around that is to hire a contract company to come in and do a specific job for them. It might be pruning if you have an orchard, or it might be harvest if you're growing row crop vegetables. So you might think that total harvest costs would be included in this column, this labor cost column, but there's a zero here. And that's because they're not paying their own employees to do this job like they are to do ground preparation and do pest management. They're just paying a harvest contract company to come in and do that work for them. And sometimes they pay them a flat rate, and sometimes they pay them a rate by unit that they harvest. So per case of broccoli, they'll pay them so much. And so the cost to harvest comes down here in the total cost column. So it's the $6,188. Now those two things together, the total cultural costs and the harvest costs, are our total operating costs per acre down here. So that's $9,865 is our cultural costs plus our harvest costs. And then the other cost that I'm interested in is your cash overhead cost. So these are those fixed costs that don't change, and they're in the next part of your study. And keep in mind that every study may be formatted slightly differently. So when you first open your study, don't get totally, try not to get totally overwhelmed by all of this information. Just break it down by looking at the titles of the tables, and you should see something like up here at the top, total cost per acre to produce and harvest broccoli. So you know that that's one of the tables that you want to look at. And then this is the continuation of that first table. So cash overhead, we want to look at cash overhead costs per acre. So for all of those fixed costs, we have 2,157. It's another of the costs we want to look at. And then our total cash costs per acre, which is our fixed costs here, our overhead, plus our variable costs from up here, which is our cultural and our harvest costs. The total of both of those is here in this total cash costs per acre. So we know that it costs a grower $12,000 about to produce broccoli per acre of cropland. So those are the 4 costs that I asked you to find for this week. There is a little bit of a difference for folks who have what we call annual crops, which are a lot of our vegetable crops that are things that the farmer puts the plants in the ground and then they harvest from, and that's it. Versus a perennial crop, which is a more permanent crop like an orchard or a vineyard or something like that. You don't have to replant an orchard every year, right? It stays in the ground and then you continue to harvest from it year after year. That's what we call a perennial crop. An annual crop, you grow it once or maybe twice in the year, and then that's it. It's removed and it's replaced with another crop. So for you folks who have a perennial crop as your crop, so this is any tree crop, fruits, nuts, or a vineyard crop like grapes, yours might look a little bit different. So it might, let's go back and find one that, let's see. We're going to find one perennial crop so I can show you guys what the difference is. And let's look at wine grapes. And we're going to let's just look at this one. Chardonnay grapes, establishment and production. So as you might imagine, when you plant an orchard, you have very different costs at that beginning period when you're actually establishing your orchard. And different types of trees or different types of vines have a different establishment period, which is kind of the period in which, or between planting your trees or your vines and then being able to actually really harvest from them. You generally don't get a harvest the first few years of any tree or vineyard crop. So if this is the case for you, you will have, the first table won't be your operating costs. The first table will be your sample costs to establish a vineyard. So most of the perennial crops, the establishment tables have the first 3 years. So we have cost per acre for years 1, years 2, and years 3. So these 3 years are your establishment period. So I'm interested in both your operating costs, like we looked at earlier, and your establishment costs. I'd like to know your total establishment costs. This is broken down into, let's see, this section here is total pre-planting cost. So all of the groundwork that goes into preparing your fields to be planted out with your crop. And then we have total planting costs. So what it costs to actually put those trees or those vines in the ground. And then your cultural costs for the first 3 years. So again, these are those things like fertilizing and weeding and pruning and taking care of insect pests. Those are all in the cultural costs. And you'll see we have costs for the first year, for the second year, and for the third year. And then it looks like here they have started to harvest on that third year. So they didn't harvest years 1 and 2, and they start to harvest in that year. So what we are looking at here, the table continues down here, and the last line should be the total accumulated net cost per acre. Now remember, this is for establishment. So this is what it's going to cost the grower for the first 3 years of that crop being in the ground. The first year, they're going to spend $25,000. The second year, the total that they've spent, so the first and the second year combined, is $31,000. And then by the third year, they will have spent $33,000 to establish that orchard. It's per acre. So this is an interesting thing to look at because we have to keep in mind that these first 3 years, the farmers really aren't making any money. Maybe they harvest a tiny bit in that third year, but it's probably not enough to make any significant amount of money. So $33,000 per acre when you're not getting any return, that's really expensive. So it's an interesting thing to think about, the amount of risk that farmers take on when they spend this kind of money on something and we can't start getting a return until usually year 5 or year 7 when you're talking about tree or orchard crops. So this total accumulated net cost for the entire period of establishment, which will be represented in this last column, the bottom right of table 1, that's one of the costs I'm interested in if you have a perennial crop. Now, below that, in the next table, is where you will find your production costs. So that's what we just looked at for broccoli. So your yearly production costs. Okay, so that's the cost studies. I know that these can be kind of confusing and really intimidating. If you are having a hard time looking at this at all, please let me know and I can help you work through it. You can find a time to meet on Zoom or in my office hours, and I'll help you start to decipher it. So that will get you through questions 1 through 4. And again, you'll have to use your knowledge from this week's lecture material to answer some of these questions, as well as the information from the cost and return studies. On number 5, you're going to have to do some research on your own. And remember, we want to use reliable resources, not necessarily just Wikipedia or Joe Schmo's farming blog. If you use Wikipedia is a good place to start sometimes, but go to their references where they found the information and then take the information from that reference, because we want to make sure that we are being accurate, because crowdsourced information is not always accurate. So you'll answer these 3 questions based on your own research and your own knowledge about the food system and the food dollar. Okay, and then the last part, we are going to use something called FRED to answer some questions about trends in crop values or prices over time. So FRED stands for the Federal Reserve Economic Data. And this is a database that takes all kinds of economic data from all different sectors, not just the agricultural sector, but from all over, and gives you a way to analyze it. So if you click on this link, FRED, it will take you to this page. This is the home page. And you're going to use the search function to find information about your commodity. Now, I have found that FRED's search function is not super great, honestly, the way that it comes up with search results. So I have found that the best way to find your commodity is to use these words: producer, price, farm, and then your commodity. So let's put in broccoli. Sometimes your commodity will come up at the very beginning of these search results, and sometimes it will not. This is what I mean by their search function not being super great. I think they could use a little help from Google on this, but it will be here. I have checked that all of the commodities have a producer price on FRED. So you might just have to scroll down and kind of scan until you find your commodity. It may be on the second page or something, but here's broccoli. So this is what we come up with. We have a graph that shows us over time the relative price that producers get. That's this producer price. So not the price that it sells for to the consumer, but the price that the producer gets. We can look at the price over time, basically, is what I'm saying. And you'll notice over here on the y-axis, it just says index. So these are not like dollar values. What an index is in economics is they take a baseline. They decide that the baseline is going to be a price of $100, for example. And then year to year, they compare the price to that baseline. So this doesn't actually tell you what the price was, but it does tell you the trend in the price. So I want you to look at about the last 10 years of data and just kind of get a feel for the volatility of the price of your commodity. Some commodities, apparently like broccoli, the price goes up and down a lot, even like within the same year. So here's November. We have a price index, November 2013, we have a price index of 385. And then by December, we're down here at 110. So 385 to 110 in 1 month, that's a big swing. So that tells us that producer price is very volatile for this particular commodity, for broccoli. You could compare this to some other commodities, like this is the graph for almonds, and this looks really different, right? You have these like big plateaus where the price remains the same for months. So look at some other commodities just out of curiosity and see how they're different. Whether your commodity is particularly volatile or particularly stable. So look at the last 10 years of data, and I'd like for you to take a screenshot of this to include with what you turn in, the answers to the questions, and think about the trends, like what's happening over time here. So the price of broccoli is really volatile, but it's kind of trending up, especially since 2020. We had a period where it was maybe roughly the same, trending up a little bit here, and then it starts to go up more. So I want to see what kind of trend you can get out of this graph. So that's one of the questions. And then the other question asks you to compare this data from Fred to the graphs that you produced in part 1. Now, there may or may not be a correlation there. You might see the price over the last 10 years of your commodity rising, reflected both in this price index data and also in the crop value from your graph from last time. So I want to see what you guys, if you guys can compare them and kind of see any correlation at all. And like I said, it's not the case for every commodity. If it's not the case, then say that it doesn't look like there's any relationship there. But if it is, go ahead and make a note of that. Okay, so like I said, this part is due on the 19th, and what is due is a summarized answer to each of these questions. Make sure you label numbers 1, 2, and 3 so that I know what I'm looking at. And then the Fred data, and turn that in as a PDF in the assignment, which will be right under the tab for this this project part 2 tab. I will update this if your commodity is one that I want you to use a specific study. There might be some that like don't have establishment costs, and I want to make sure that you have the right study to look at. So make sure to check if your commodity is listed on this page at the bottom with a particular study. then make sure to use that study, please. It will make it easier for you. So yeah, that is it. Let me know if you have any questions or if you're having a hard time interpreting any of this data. I know it's kind of a data heavy part of the project, but it's important to be able to look through data and extract information from it. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with.